Yeah, let's get to the news of the day. The Associated Press reports that two bombs exploded and killed at least 95 people today at a commemoration for prominent Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. We'll remember, years ago when that initial killing happened, he was killed by the U.S. in a 2020 drone strike. We don't have video of the explosion that happened in Iran today, but you can hear it briefly in this clip. Let's take this. Okay, so no one immediately claimed responsibility for the attack. You hear some of the panicked voices of the people that were in the immediate vicinity over there. Alone, the Middle East is already on edge over Israel and Hamas. What implications does today's news have on this war?
So first of all, I'll just add that since the initial reports, the reports in Iran at least are indicating at least 210 or 211 people have been killed in these two explosions. So it's even a lot greater than was initially reported in the Associated Press. And the implications could be vast. Iran and Iranian president and Iranian supreme leader immediately blamed Israel, said that it was collaborators of the Mossad that had to do with this. I will say from my own analysis, that is highly unlikely. There does not appear to have been any dominant political figure, rather just massive carnage of people who were around the tomb site on the anniversary of Qasem Soleimani's death. It fits the profile more of different non-state actors that are operating within Iran, and there's a lot of them. There's the Baluchistan forces coming out of Pakistan. There's ISIS, there's Al-Qaeda. It fits more their profile rather than attacks that are carried out from Israel, just from a strategic point of view. States don't usually tend to carry out these acts unless they actually are managing to, or attempting at least, to kill prominent figures, such as Qasem Soleimani, or we're going to talk later about Salah al-Aruri, and things like that. So in terms of who is responsible, it is far more likely to be a non-state actor, I'll say at least at this point. However, that does not mean, as you stated, the Middle East is very on edge. That does not mean that it's not going to be used in order to fuel escalations elsewhere. Iran can use this in order to now justify further attacks it will carry out, let's say, against maritime vessels in the Indian Ocean, or support that it gives the Houthis in their attacks in the Red Sea. So it is likely to pour more fuel on the fire, even though it unto itself may not have been actually part of the ongoing Israeli struggle with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. It may have been something unrelated. It is still likely going to contribute to these escalations.
And Alon, we also want to play this video. So, an airstrike killed senior Hamas leader Saleh al-Aruri yesterday in an attack widely attributed to Israel, per Reuters. This crosses off a big name from Israel's most wanted list, but could this drive other exiled leaders deeper into hiding?
Very likely, yes, although most of the exiled leaders were not living in hiding. Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal, and Salah al-Aruri, all of these leaders are prominent figures. They're public figures. Ismail Haniyeh lives very, very openly in Qatar, and Khalid Mashal also, Salah al-Aruri, Khalil al-Khaya, all these names, these are people who were very much out in the open. Israel's not carried out such a high-profile assassination against a senior Hamas leader for years. This attack is very, very significant. Salah al-Aruri not only was the deputy leader of Hamas, not only was he the person in charge of the Al-Qassam brigades in the West Bank, he's also one of the figures who is, while the Hamas attributed to him, called him the architect of October 7th attack. That is very unlikely that he actually had anything to do with October 7th attack specifically, but he is the architect of developing the strategy of Hamas, that is to say, attacks should not only come from Gaza. He wanted to create a ring that would suffocate Israel with Hamas attacks from Gaza and other terrorist attacks from the West Bank, and Hamas and Hezbollah from Lebanon. He's really responsible for creating these connections to also the militias in Syria. So attacking him not only is a very, very symbolic step, it is a very practical step. He is the person who is very much in charge of all these connections. These images that you're seeing on the camera that you're showing are his connections to Iran, his connections to Hezbollah, his connections to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So in that sense, it's a very, very significant step in Israel's fight against Hamas. But more importantly, it's also a symbolic step, and saying Hamas leadership abroad is no longer seen as something that is different and separate from the war in Gaza, as far as assuming that Israel is the one who carried this out. Israel hasn't admitted that, but I think we can safely assume that that is the case. Then Israel's trying to state The war is an all-out war against Hamas wherever they may be. There's something very powerful and symbolic about this operation that was carried out specifically in Dahya in Beirut, which is the stronghold of Hezbollah as well. It's a message to Hezbollah as well.
When we talk about much of what al-Aruri was known for before these attacks, is there any clarity on perhaps what role he's been playing within Hamas since October 7th? And perhaps what Hamas is losing with his death?
So since October 7th, Hamas has been desperately trying to drag everyone else into the war. The morning of October 7th, Hamas called upon Hezbollah, the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Houthis, the militias in Yemen. They called upon everyone to join this regional war to finally eradicate Israel once and for all. Much to Hamas's astonishment, Hezbollah did not join the war. Hezbollah is very angry at Hamas for launching the war without actually coordinating with it in advance. According to an expose that was done, I believe, by the New York Times, although I'm not sure. It was a very, very in-depth expose. And sorry, it wasn't by the New York Times. It was by Le Figaro newspaper in France. That looked at how October 7th was orchestrated. They stated that Hamas sent messages to their representatives in Lebanon, that's Khalil al-Haya and Salah al-Aruri, half an hour before the October 7th attack was launched, telling them, this is about to be launched now. Go tell Hezbollah to join the war. And Hezbollah felt slapped in the face. They were not coordinated with them in advance. And since then, Salah al-Aruri's main role since October 7th has been to try to organize this international coalition, to try to place pressure on Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah was not willing to throw its full weight into the war, which is by no means has done, then to possibly orchestrate a lot of pressure against the Houthis or against the Iranian militias. So in that sense, Salah al-Aruri's role has been very regional. It has been to try to coordinate Hamas's activity in Lebanon, as well as the militias in Syria, as well as possibly coordinating with Hezbollah and the Houthis. And his death is going to be a big strike against that. And that is one of the things that Israel has done in the last month. Again, attacks are, I say Israel, attributed to Israel. Israel is not taking responsibility for them, but I think we can safely say that the assassination of Raza Mousavi, who was one of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who was assassinated in Syria, also the person in charge of this coordinating weapons smuggling between Iran and Hezbollah, Israel seems to have decided to take to the next step, the attempt to circumvent and launch strikes against this regional ring that is funding and orchestrating these attacks from the north, possibly in order to try to avoid a full-scale war breaking out in the north. Others have speculated that Israel is actually trying to drive towards the breaking out of a full-scale war, but does not want to launch the initial strike against Hezbollah. So instead, it is constantly escalating more and more, attacking these public figures to get Hezbollah to launch the first strike. But either way, Israel seems to have openly declared, we are now coming after anyone who plays a critical role in fueling this regional development from Iran, Syria, Lebanon in the war between Israel and Hamas.
And you may have already just touched on this, but since the war started, including today, the IDF and Hezbollah have engaged in a series of, you might call it low-intensity skirmishes on the Lebanon-Israel border. But do I have it right that this is the first Israeli attack deep in Lebanese territory? What's the level of concern that this could escalate an already delicate situation?
So there's a lot of complexities in the relationship, I'll say, between Israel and the different terror organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas. And these are what we call tacit agreements. These sort of agreements that have developed over the years. For example, it was well known that if Hamas, prior to October 7th, would launch rockets into Israel, if they were targeting the south, Israel would retaliate much more moderately. If they targeted Tel Aviv, Israel would retaliate more heavily. Similarly, it has these agreements with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah even said that they are not going to be the ones to break the rules of the game. The rules of the game right now between Israel and Hezbollah are low-level intensities. Hezbollah is sending every day missiles and rockets and mortars, and Israel is in turn retaliating against Hezbollah launching sites, infrastructures, but it is not, for example, carpet bombing areas of Hezbollah activists. Similarly here, Israel did sort of one-up. It did say now carry out a very high-profile assassination in the Dahya neighborhood of Beirut, which is the stronghold of Hezbollah on the one hand. On the other hand, it's very important to note it did not attack a Hezbollah figure. It attacked a Hamas figure. So again, that's still playing, quote-unquote, within the rules of the game. Israel did not try to assassinate the leader of Hezbollah. That would be breaking all the rules, saying we're going to all-out war. Instead, it's sending a message that Israel's willing to escalate and has the ability to escalate, and almost saying, like, I challenge you, I one-up you, on the one hand. On the other hand, not completely breaking the rules of the game. So right now it's up to Hezbollah. Will Hezbollah see this as Israel has now, slapped us in the face and violated the rules to the extent that it's worth it for Hezbollah to jump into the war? So far, at least publicly, Hezbollah is saying no. One of the top figures in Hezbollah, prior to Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech today. Prior to that speech, one of the top figures was quoted as saying that Hezbollah is not going to give Israel what it wants by letting Israel drag it into a war. The foreign minister of Lebanon also said that it hopes that Hezbollah does not decide to break all the rules and drag Lebanon into a war. So far, at least publicly, Hezbollah is not going to do that. My guess is if they in fact do not launch an all-out war against Israel, they are going to try to retaliate by carrying out some sort of terror attack internationally against either Israeli figures or Jewish figures and say, see, we retaliated that way. So it has the potential, but this is really up to Hezbollah. Up until now, since October 7th, Hezbollah has been very adamant that it does not intend to throw its full weight into the war. That it's doing this because it has its own political considerations in Lebanon, very different than Hamas. Seemingly right now, they're still going to adhere to the quote-unquote rules of the game and not, say, okay, all bets are off. But as usual, it remains to be seen in the volatile Middle East.
Northern Israel and southern Lebanon, something we're going to be keeping a close eye on in the immediate future here. We also wanted to show you this video, Dr. Burstein. Let's move to Gaza. The Associated Press says that heavy fighting raged in central and southern Gaza today, but up north, I thought this was interesting. Times of Israel reporter Manny Fabian posting this video within the past week saying the IDF located and demolished a hideout apartment belonging to Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in northern Gaza, along with a large tunnel system underneath it. Now, the IDF says it found, quote, many findings in the apartment that indicated it was used by Sinwar as a hideout. We've seen reports that Sinwar may have fled south. Is there any level of confidence that Israeli forces will eventually close in on him?
It's very difficult to say. It really depends how long the war goes on. Assuming the war would go on indefinitely, I think that Israel would be very happy to keep up the war as long as it needed in order to kill Yahya Sinwar for many reasons. Many of them also have to do with the Israeli public opinion and the political survival of the government, showing he is, the big bad. He's the Osama bin Laden of Israel right now. So in the same way, when the United States launched the war against Al-Qaeda, right, it was important to take over Afghanistan. It was important to dismantle Al-Qaeda, but really killing bin Laden was seen as the victory over Al-Qaeda. Similarly, Yahya Sinwar right now in Israel is seen as the bin Laden figure. So Israel, as far as it's concerned, would be very happy to continue the war, I'd say, as long as it takes in order to get Yahya Sinwar. Will they actually do that? Israel's eventually going to be compelled to carry out some sort of ceasefire and start rebuilding Gaza. It may happen in a month. It may happen in 6 months. So it really depends how long he can survive. What is happening, though, what you described in terms of the fighting down south and the fighting in the north, is one of the things that's very misunderstood about the war, because Israel keeps on saying that, it's taken over the north. But really what that means is that it has taken what the IDF calls operational control of the territory. That means that the IDF is moving freely through the town and there's no pockets of resistance that are held by Hamas operatives as there are, for example, down south in Khan Yunis. But that does not mean that the IDF actually has, quote unquote, purged everything, all Hamas hideouts in the north. There are still many pockets of Hamas resistance in Gaza City, in Darj Tufah, in other areas that are in the north, Sajaiya, Jabalia refugee camp. And that is why what we're seeing is, on the one hand, the bulk of the fighting, theoretically, the face-to-face gun battles, are down south, because there, in Khan Yunis, for example, or in Rafah, large territory is still controlled by Hamas, whereas in the north, it has turned into much more of guerrilla fighting style, where the IDF has taken over almost every city. Darj Tufah is the last one that still remains somewhat in Hamas control. However, there are still many, many pockets of resistance. There's still many gun battles with Hamas fighters that are emerging from buildings, emerging from tunnels. And even though 1.9 million people in the Gaza Strip have become internally displaced and have moved down south, there are still thousands of people in the north. So the IDF has operational control over, for example, Gaza City, but then it still all of a sudden comes across an apartment of Yahya Sinwar. And then it finds a tunnel under it that, if I remember correctly, it stated was 250 meters long and, several. We usually don't do meters, so I actually don't know that the reports come in meters, very deep in the ground. And that was that detonation that you were seeing. So the IDF is reporting that it's taken over the north, but really the fighting isn't done in the north. It's just the attempt to take over the city and allow the IDF to move freely is still going on. But every day there are still gun battles there. Every day there's still bombings going on there. So that's really one of the reasons that they're still all of a sudden uncovering again. Like, if you think about it, this substantially long tunnel in an area that the IDF, which supposedly has some of the best intelligence in the world, should have already known about, should have already taken over, uncovers all of a sudden. That tells you that on the one hand, it has control of Gaza City. On the other hand, not in every pocket, if it still doesn't know about all the tunnels that are underneath the city and maybe who's being held there or who's hiding there.
The last time I had spoken with an IDF spokesperson, we asked them that exact question about the operational control that was being reported, and they said that they were hesitant to use such strong language because of the exact thing that you're mentioning, that there are still pockets that present challenges in the north. Let's pull up one final thing. This is the last thing we want to hit before we go here. Al Jazeera reported that the Palestinian death toll in Gaza rose above 22,000 this week, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health. We're also continuing to see horrific stories about starvation and displacement in the enclave. You're seeing on screen right now a tweet from the United Nations describing some of the desperate conditions in Gaza right now. There's obviously been a terrifying amount of civilian casualties during this war, Doctor, but what is the Gaza Ministry of Health, and how reliable is the Gaza Ministry of Health? Obviously, when you hear something is run by Hamas, it leads to some questions.
On the one hand, obviously, anything run by Hamas was a well-established terror organization, is not something to be taken offhand. Oh, those are the accurate figures. On the other hand, historically, the health ministry in the Gaza Strip, even though it is run by Hamas, has been, I'll say, fairly accurate. That is to say, they have no problem instinctively putting out, images or figures that, are not confirmed yet in order to deface Israel, make Israel look bad. We saw this in the Al Ahli hospital bombing, that they immediately said that it was a bombing of Israel, but it turns out that it was a failed rocket launch of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, etc. On the one hand. On the other hand, historically, when we go to all the rounds of fighting between Israel and Hamas, usually the figures of deaths that they put out end up being fairly accurate, not in the sense that they're actually counting everybody, but because even if the numbers are somewhat inflated, there are still thousands upon thousands of people that are buried under the rubble. I mean, 40 to 50% of the buildings in northern Gaza Strip are completely destroyed. There are thousands of people that are buried under the rubble. So even if the confirmed number of deaths, let's say, is 5,000, less than the Gazan Health Ministry says, and I don't think it is, but even if it is, usually those numbers end up catching up by the end of the war when the amount of people who are missing are confirmed dead under the rubbles of the monumental amount of bombings. So I don't take those numbers as, engraved in stone. That is obviously like the number that, any bureaucracy like we would count on an American bureaucracy or European bureaucracy. I don't take it as official on the one hand. On the other hand, historically speaking, it does give usually a fairly good assessment of the amount of people who, when things are tallied up, are going to be confirmed dead. So I do take that as a good measure, unfortunately, of roughly how many people are killed, even if it's not accurate down to the exact number.
Horrific situation in Gaza. Dr. Alon Burstein, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Have a good night.